time, we'll have Foner. Kenny is a research software developer at Grad, which is one of the top consultancy companies in functional programming and verification in industry. And Kenny's going to talk about a really important topic for grad students, which is mental health. And I really look forward to this talk. I think we're very fortunate to have Kenny here at Grad. Thanks very much.
So, excellent. I'm always surprised when the speaker happens. So, I want to talk about how academia can be a little bit tricky when your brain can't even do things. But to do that, I want to first note that this talk has some difficult stuff in it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of mental illness. I'm going to talk about chronic disability. I'm going to mention suicide, although I'm not going to go into detail about it. And these things are hard. Like, they're genuinely, legitimately hard. So I want to say, if you're having a hard time, for whatever reason, you can check Twitter on your phone. You can leave the room. You can go outside and call a friend. I'm not going to judge you. No one here is going to judge you. And please just don't question people if they want to do those things, because I think it's really important to be able to be gentle to each other. So with all of that, here I am in Athens, but it's a long way away from where I usually am. So I just wanted to give a bit of a sort of spatial bio of me, which is, so I was born and raised in Natick, Massachusetts, which is this upper thing here. This is a little map of the east coast of the United States, which may not be completely familiar to some of you. I got you. Hold on 1 minute. I went to undergrad nearby at Brandeis University. I did 3 years of a PhD, and as I've already talked about in the panel earlier today, I finished with my master's instead of continuing on to finish the PhD. And as Mariana said, I'm now working in industry at Galois. But now I'm in Athens, and I'm actually surprised at how quickly I managed to adjust to the time zone, so that's pretty cool. This is the zoomed out picture. So that's space, right? Space is cool, but I want to talk about time. So here's a timeline of important events. And the first important event that I want to put on this is in May of 1993, I was born. Now, you may say, oh, well, okay. But this is globally important to everyone. And in November of 2019, more relevantly to you, I'm here. But I really want to talk about something that happened in August of 2016 in Seattle. So in August of 2016, I was an intern at the PL group at Microsoft Research in Redmond, which is like right near Seattle. And basically, I spent all of my non-researchy time in Seattle because Seattle is really cool. And well, Redmond's pretty cool, but Seattle has a lot more of this. So I did a lot of hiking and cycling and hanging out with cool nerds. And in between, I also did some PL research, as evidenced by, look at these typing rules, right? So yeah, Seattle is a really awesome city. MSR is a fantastic place to do an internship. And I should have been having the time of my life, right? Like, I should have been, absolutely delighting in the experience that I was lucky enough to have. And in some ways, in a lot of ways, I was. But at the same time, I couldn't fall asleep one day, and I couldn't wake up the next. And I was ravenously hungry 1 hour, and I couldn't eat the next. And these things just sort of started to pile up as I was spending more and more time there that summer. I would be outgoing and social and extroverted and just full of energy and enthusiasm and talking to people and the Daphne programming language is the next coming of formal verification. And then the next week, I would just want to be left alone just completely forever. Just don't speak to me. So one day, I came home and I was particularly hungry and particularly disoriented and particularly lacking in ability to even. I went to the supermarket. I forget the name, but it was a supermarket nearby where I was living in the university district. And I got this delicious Mexican-style frozen lasagna. It's really yummy looking on the package, except for the problem is that, as I didn't realize at the time, it took 45 minutes to cook in the oven because it comes as packaged as a giant block of lasagna ice. So this will become relevant. I promise you this will become relevant. So unfortunately, after 45 minutes, my hand slipped. And, well, some people cry over spilled milk, but I found myself sort of lying on the floor, weeping over the spilled lasagna because I felt like this had somehow been like the end of my ability to tolerate existence. Like, it just felt like I had tried so hard to get to a place where I could even just, oh, I don't know, eat dinner. And now it was 9:00 p.m. and I had been just stripped of all of my capacity to function. So I recognized, and with the great help of my partner at the time, I recognized that it was probably not like within the sort of normal bounds of operation of human beings to like lie on the floor for 45 minutes after you spill lasagna. So I went to the doctor the next day, and I thought, okay, well, maybe I have diabetes or something. Like maybe my blood sugar is just like really messing with my appetite and my energy levels. Nope, turns out I have a really healthy pancreas, like actually a fantastically healthy pancreas, I was told at the time, which is like pretty cool, I guess. My thyroid is middle of the road, which is, I guess, middle of the road. And so my doctor is like, okay, well, we've run all these blood tests, but that doesn't really rule out everything that we could possibly think about. And so at this point, the doctor turns to me, and I realized this could be a little bit of a risky move on the part of my doctor, so I'm glad that they read me well. He turns to me and he says, could I bring in my med student? Because you're sort of a textbook case. Like, I just want her to really like understand exactly what bipolar disorder looks like. And this could have been like a really like emotionally like wrenching thing for him to say. But for me, I was like, yeah, I get to participate in the education of another doctor. Like, like awesome, sweet. And also like somebody was able to actually give a name to what I was experiencing. So yeah, I've never actually, this is the first time that I've stood up in front of a big group of my peers and actually talked about this. And I talk about mental illness in generalities a lot of the time. And I think it's really something super important, and I hope that most of you agree with me. But I think it's also really important to talk about it in specifics. And so I'm telling you my specific story because I want you to understand the sort of background, the prior work, as it were, to this talk. Because situating within that context, there's a problem, and the problem is people don't talk about mental health. And I want to propose some novel solutions, or maybe I'm not the one who originated some of them. You can call this like a synthesis or something. But in any case, I want to just say a little bit about what happened next to sort of ground what I'm going to talk about in what my specific path is before I move on to talking about mental health and mental illness in generality, and offering a lot of thoughts. So I first want to say I was incredibly lucky to have an amazing mentor at Microsoft Research, Rustin Leno, who, when I told him about this diagnosis, he was like, okay, you do the things you need to do to be healthy, and also hopefully we'll do some cool research along the way, but it'll be what you need it to be. And that freedom gave me the ability to rest and recover from what sort of was a blue screen of brain. And after that, I've been in talk therapy more or less continuously for about 3 years. Highly, highly recommended. Most universities, at least in the US, have low-cost counseling that are available for students. And I recommend, even if you have no inkling whatsoever that you have any kind of mental illness, that you take advantage of this, because it's somebody who will listen to you for almost free and help you figure out how to solve problems in your head. It's like having a debugger who's a whole person who you can talk to for your brain. And also, I experimented a lot with figuring out the right blend of psychiatric medications that would actually keep my physical and emotional symptoms under control. So I'm not a doctor, and I'm not here to convince you that the solution to if you have a mental illness is to just do drugs. But for some people, for people like me, and I think for a lot of people, psychiatric medications can be a really big part of the answer. And they can be really scary, but I want to destigmatize talking about it. So that was a long process, and I've only recently gotten to the point where where I can actually pretty confidently say that I think that I'm taking the right medications to be healthy. It was a long process. But that wasn't like so some of you might be thinking, and then I quit Penn. But actually, I spent 2 more years in the PhD program at Penn. I wrote 3 papers, or co-wrote 3 papers. At least one of my co-authors is in the room. I gave 3 talks. I did a bunch of coursework along the way and got a sort of like passing through master's degree. And I want to sort of extend a general gratitude towards Penn and the PL group at Penn for being an incredibly welcoming environment that made a lot of this a lot easier, and especially to my advisor, Stephanie Wyrick, who was instrumental in my ability to recover and my ability to sort of thrive throughout this. So in the end, well, you know that part. Actually, I want to first also say part of that ability to thrive was also enabled by me taking some sort of positive actions to build accommodation structures around myself. So some of the things I did, and I recommend that you do, are asking for more flexible due dates. It is often the case that in undergrad, professors view students as adversarial. And I think that even in undergrad, this is a mistake. I think that it's really unkind, and I think that it does a disservice to the integrity of the students that are in the classroom. But I think that in grad school, the better story is that your professors are not your adversary. They are your ally. And so asking, can I do this assignment but have a little bit more flexibility about when I turn it in, is a thing that you can totally do. And the worst answer will be no. Usually the worst answer will be no, but let's see if we can figure out a different plan for you to do the thing. I also asked for more frequent check-ins with my advisor because I found that accountability would really help me to at least keep her up to date about the degree to which I was not able to do my work, but frequently about the degree to which I was able to do my work, and that increased. So yes, it is really hard to disclose when you're experiencing mental illness, but if you do feel safe doing that, and I do believe that you will be surrounded by people who you can be safe doing that around, it's incredibly helpful to actually talk about this with the people who are there to support you. In any case, at that point, I said, well, I'm still struggling a lot, and a lot of factors combined that I can talk about a little bit more. And I decided to do a trial run in industry. So I decided I'm going to take a year off of my PhD and do a leave in industry at Galois. Turns out industry was pretty cool for some reasons that we talked about during the panel, and I decided to stay, and various things came to pass, and here I am talking to you. So I want to say a little bit now about why I decided to leave and anchor in the fact that, or sort of anchor in an understanding of like how this relates to my experience of mental illness. So like, I loved PL at Penn. The academic PL community, including this community, including the broader community this is part of, has been home to me for like 8 years or something, and it's hard to imagine my life without it. But of course, I left my PhD program without a PhD. And I did that for a lot of reasons, but I think predominantly because the structure and balance, as we were talking about in the panel, gave me a lot more stability, which anchored my ability to become more healthy. And also, I wanted to be able to more actively choose my life path, picking a lot more about location and working style than I might have been able to in some academic positions. So we've talked about that a lot, and I'm not going to belabor it. But I want to say, if I could do it again, I would. Academia didn't do me a disservice, and I didn't regret doing it just because I left. I would do exactly, more or less exactly. I have some corrections that I might want to make on like revision 2 or whatever. But I would do most of the broad arcs of what I exactly did again. And I still have this community. Leaving traditional academia didn't mean that I lost the academic community. So why mental health at PLMW? A lot of people like me live with mental illnesses, and here are some stats, right? These percentages are present. It means that in a room as big as this, I can guarantee, almost guarantee, that there are people in this room who represent most of these different mental illnesses. So it's important because we're a community, and because a community is made of whole people. And we need to nurture that community in order to have it. So it's also particularly relevant here because these statistics for this particular biased sample are ridiculous underestimates. Because in academia, it's not 7% of graduate students who are depressed. It's 47% of graduate students who are depressed. Or 53% of academic staff in the United Kingdom. There are study after study after study that demonstrate that the rates of mental illness in academia are, dare I say, statistically significant. And of course, my research is not very empirical, so I don't know much about statistical significance, but 6 times more likely to be depressed seems about there for me. So doing the math, this is what we're looking at. So I'm looking at this group of people, and I'm seeing that some hair under half of you might at some point experience clinical depression during your graduate studies, or are experiencing it. And many graduate students don't get diagnosed until they're early in their PhD programs, because a lot of mental illnesses only kick into effect, into full gear, as it were, until you're like in your early 20s or so, which just happens to line up really nicely or really poorly if you really follow through on the logic with when you show up in grad school. So, here's some correlations. I suggest some possible causations. Could it be that grad school is responsible for making mental illness worse? Could it be that if you have mental illness, it might be more likely for you to attend grad school? Or maybe there are some shared causes that are responsible for factors that influence people having mental illness and also people attending grad school. So I don't have enough data to back up exactly which one of these it is, but I suspect that it's probably a bit of all three. I want to talk about this one especially, though, and I want to talk about exactly how I think it functions. So in grad school, there's a lot of what I call accountability latency. And what I mean by that is frequently, when you have to do something, there's a long lag before you actually are sort of forced to have done that thing. We were talking about like the death march of papers earlier. And when you have the death march of a paper, you really don't actually have to work on it at any given day up until it starts to be really time. And then when it starts to be really time, and then when you actually have to push through and do the thing, you're implicitly rewarded by the system for being a hero in the face of this huge astronomical challenge which you brought on yourself during this high stress crunch time. And it's also difficult to know, I think, as I said earlier, that you're allowed to stop when your goals are partly self-determined. When you have this kind of self-created structure in grad school, it's tricky to actually allow yourself to breathe and to rest. I also want to make a note. Grad school, although you are funded, can be financially stressful nonetheless. Not a lot, like many of you will be in like single income earner households. Some of you will have families in those households, and it is very financially difficult to support a family on like a stipend of a PhD student. It's also the case that there's large amounts of cash that you have to drop to attend a conference a lot of the time. I know that I personally, when I was a grad student, had to spend about like $2,000 to go to an international conference and then wait for 2 to 3 months to be reimbursed by my university, because apparently this is possible to do on a regular basis on a $30,000 stipend. And then beyond that, there's all this uncertainty about the future, because I think, or I hope we've all heard at this point, that there are not as many academic jobs as there are people getting PhDs by a large factor, which means that most of the people who get a PhD are not going to be able to get a professorship because of the pigeonhole principle or whatever. Like, it's just how the math works out. And so there's this like existential void that you're hoping you don't fall into, but you know that you could, and it's a big luck of the draw a lot of the time. So none of these things create mental illness. I don't have bipolar disorder because of accountability latency or because of self-determined goals or financial stress or future existential dread or something like that. But these things do make it worse when you have a predisposition or where you actually do have a mental illness. And they're not only, they don't only, and rather, these conditions of existence both make worse and are also made worse by a couple of things, or rather two couples of things, which I want to talk about and sort of decompose. Not just for people who actually have diagnosed mental illnesses, but for basically everybody. And I want to offer you in the rest of the talk some technologies that we can use to break these tangled cycles where this makes these worse and these make this worse. And I claim that the technologies that I'm going to offer are unusually effective and not entirely obvious, or at least they weren't to me, but maybe that's because I just haven't been paying attention. But I also don't hear a lot of people talking about some of them. So I hope that they will be novel to at least some of you, and that would be enough. So executive dysfunction. Maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't. I didn't stumble across it until I started thinking about, like, what is this mental illness thing that I have, that I apparently have been diagnosed with? And so if you look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia says that executive functions, collectively referred to as executive function or cognitive control, are a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior, selecting and successfully monitoring behaviors that facilitate the attainment of chosen goals. I think that some of the writing advice that we heard earlier in session would probably have helped us to clean up this garden path sentence. But I fixed it for you, because it turns out that in the dev tools in Google Chrome, you can just like go in and edit a web page. So then I took another screenshot of Wikipedia where I had substituted what I think it should actually say. Because executive function, when it comes down to it, is just the ability to do a thing when you want to do the thing and you really need to do the thing. And I know that's kind of a vague term, but I find that it's really helpful because it puts a neutral word, like a neutral word, to a real struggle that almost all of us have sometimes. And that struggle, of course, is its inverse, executive dysfunction, which is when you really need to do the thing. You just need to do it, but somehow you just can't. I think that's highly relatable, even for people who don't have mental illnesses that make this thing even more of a thing. And the real reason that I care so much about talking about executive dysfunction is that nobody is actually lazy. And I don't want to use the word lazy, because lazy is a way of talking about executive dysfunction that actually does a disservice to talking about what it actually means. So I gave a talk at ICFP last year that was a lot of fun, I think. It was called Keep Your Laziness in Check. And it's about a generalization or an addition to quick check that lets you randomly test whether certain functions have particular kinds of strictness in Haskell, which is a lazy language. But I think I also know a little bit about the human kind of laziness. And that's because my inner narrative is filled with things like this. You know, I ask myself questions all the time. You knew what you had to do. You had enough time. What's your excuse? People are believing in your potential, so why are you letting those people down? It's such an honor to be here, so why aren't you working harder to succeed? And I say, well, these are rhetorical questions that I ask myself because my inner narrative is always rhetorical because it's speaking to itself, maybe? But in any case, the answer is clearly supposed to be that I'm incompetent, undeserving, ungrateful. I must be lazy. And I want to claim that doesn't exist, except in Haskell. If you want to do something, if I want to do something, and you don't, either you didn't actually want to do it in the first place, and I want to spend a moment on this, because if you didn't actually want to do it in the first place, that's a good reason why you didn't end up wanting to do it and why you were unable to motivate yourself to actually do it. And I want to offer this technique for figuring out whether you want to actually do something in the first place. If you think you want to do something, but you're unable to execute on it, if you lack the executive function to do that thing, first try thinking the phrase, I should do this thing, and then try replacing I should do this thing with I want to do this thing. And if you can't really put the full force of your intention behind I want to do this thing, you've been tricking yourself into thinking that a should, which is sort of a projection into the external world of like a thought about the way the universe works, into an imagination of your own want, which might be false. Or if you actually did want to do something and you didn't do that thing, then something real stopped you from doing it, because otherwise you would have done the thing. Something stopped you. And controversially, I claim your mind is something real that can stop you from doing things, just like walls and time. So let me provide an example, a concrete example that has no metavariables whatsoever. I couldn't do some important task. Well, suppose I say, oh, the reason I couldn't do this thing is because I was very depressed and I couldn't get out of bed. And someone says to me, oh, well, that's not real. It was just all in your head. Why didn't you just instead be not depressed and do the thing? I have had people say things like this, or maybe say, well, if you just did yoga, then maybe you wouldn't be depressed and you'd be able to do the things that you were depressed about. Or alternatively, perhaps I had the flu and I couldn't get out of bed. What if somebody said to me then, it's all in your body? And I would say, if somebody said this to me, the second one, I would be pretty ticked off. And I claim that you should be equally ticked off if someone says the first one to you, because I claim both of these are equally real, but we've been taught otherwise. So you might have come across the Unix philosophy that a tool should do one thing well. Lazy, the word, does one thing well, and that is to create shame. I use lazy within my internal narrative, and people use lazy within their external narratives. They speak out loud about themselves and about other people to hurt and to create shame. But shame is really hard to let go of, because fearing that I'm going to be ashamed is an incredibly powerful motivational force. I fear that if I'm not afraid of being ashamed, where else is my motivation going to come from? Because so often I just have this like spike of anxiety when I'm afraid that I'm going to be standing up in front of people and doing something. I've got to be writing that paper. I'm going to be made a fool of if I don't do that thing. So the fear of shame becomes associated with a powerful motivational force. And so I'm grasping onto it as much as it's hurting me as I hold on to it. So I claim letting go of the word lazy, which causes shame, whose one purpose is to make you ashamed of having difficulty with executive function, is a subset of the really important task of letting go of shame. And I want to make an aside that a really useful tool for trying to let go of shame and examining your own internal practice of thinking to yourself about things is mindfulness practice. And I don't have enough time in these slides to talk about like what particular mindfulness practices have really made this real for me. But I encourage you to double click on this concept. So about that, rest is also not laziness. Don't trust me, trust like a bunch of studies in the physical sciences. So resting is good for you, I claim, and so does like science. Some say, and I do believe it's important and true, resting better is something that can lead to you being able to work harder and more effectively and more efficiently. And that's absolutely the case. And is especially true in the line of work of being a PhD student, because knowledge work, the kind of work that we do, is extremely nonlinear in the kinds of things that you can do, like the way that you progress through doing it. Like sometimes you just won't make any kind of progress, and then you'll take a break, go for a run, like, I don't know, watch Netflix or something, fill up the vending machine, productively procrastinate, and then all of a sudden you'll have a great idea. And so, resting can be a useful tool for being productive. But I claim that health and happiness, yours, are ends and not just means. But, you say, rhetorically, Or maybe some of you actually say, doing nothing for a day, a week, a month, somewhere in this progression, I think some of you might have started to get uncomfortable. It sounds pretty lazy, right? I want to affirm that resting is not failing at work. Resting is succeeding at health and happiness, which I claim are ends of their own. So, confession time. I need to rest a lot. I get physically tired really easily and mentally tired really easily, especially in a typical office environment, which has things like fluorescent lights, which really don't play well with my conditions of existence. And then I feel like if I'm resting so much, I can't possibly be getting enough done. And then I start shaming myself about laziness, and the whole cycle I've been talking about happens. So, needing rest, needing different working environments, anything that sets you apart and makes you feel like you're not supposed to be here, like you need to make up for these physical or mental deficiencies, quote unquote, just to survive, can make you feel like you don't belong, like you weren't supposed to be here. And a lot of people call this imposter syndrome. So I put quotes around it because I don't believe it's a syndrome, because most people experience this phenomenon. But I do say that a lot of people say, well, everyone has imposter syndrome, right? So that means that if you feel like an imposter, then probably you belong, because smart people feel like an imposter. So if you feel like an imposter, you're probably a smart person. But that's not how the contrapositive works. So then you sort of start to doubt, and maybe you should doubt, that this reasoning is a good way to get out of imposter syndrome. And you start to wonder to yourself, or at least I do, wait a second, what if everyone else around me who has imposter syndrome is for real, and I'm just actually an imposter and correctly perceiving my conditions? And then, well, maybe you get around that, but then it's one level deeper and one level deeper, and obviously this is recursive. And in PL, we think about recursion all the time. So I propose that we think about recursion on its own terms. And notice that imposter syndrome has no base case. Right? So that means you can't think yourself out of imposter syndrome by following the loop. You have to step outside of it. And to step outside the loop, you have to understand how it works. So I think institutional systems, like universities, want prestige because they want to create an image that they're a powerful engine for research. And this is true. But they project this by creating an image that most people aren't worthy. And that image doesn't go away when you actually end up inside the system, because then you worry that it was a mistake that you ended up there. And so you don't voice the fear that maybe you're not supposed to be there in the first place, because maybe that means that you aren't supposed to be there in the first place. And that means that without hearing anyone else say that they feel that fear, we all feel like we're alone in our fears. But really, that's not true, because we're all together and we don't need to fear. So we can step outside of the loop. So corollary, voicing your fears can be really effective at breaking the loop. So I wrote this paragraph in about as much time as I could possibly read it out loud. Basically, I am frequently scared, literally, actually scared, that I'm a lazy fraud who's gotten by in academia and industry only because I have about one or one-half terrible idea about Haskell, not terrible idea about Haskell every year or so. But I'm certain that this year I'm going to run out of ideas forever, and you'll all find out that I've tricked you into believing that I'm a smart person because I like making puns about types that make people laugh sometimes. I'm afraid that I'm still here only because PL research is so full of kind people who think the best of everyone, even of someone as obviously insufficiently clever and dedicated as me. This is really real for me. This is not like me making up fluff to make you feel better. I wrote this slide and then I was like, man, do I believe that? But putting it out actually in words makes it feel a bit more silly. So we've talked about executive function, about narratives, about laziness, about imposter syndrome. All of these things make being in academia while being mentally ill, or also while being mentally healthy, even harder. And I want to talk about something different now, hope. I used to think, after my diagnosis, I'm broken and I want to fix myself. But there's no cure for bipolar disorder, or ADHD, or chronic depression, etc., etc. And I don't know what it would meaningfully be to have a cure for some of these things. And I don't think that being oriented around the language of cure is the right way to think anyhow. So right now, I don't hope for fixing something that's broken about me. Because if I think about fixing something that's broken about me as the conditions for my, hope, then that means that my hope is conditional on considering myself to be broken. And I don't want to do that. I hope instead for thriving with or despite my condition. So what does that look like? Mental health is really not monotonic. It's not the case that when you feel awful, you're going to feel awful forever or even worse in the future. It's also not the case that when you feel better and you have some kind of great leap forward in your ability to be happy, and your coping strategies and your medication or anything else that allows you to be healthy, that you're going to be permanently cured and you're never going to have to struggle again. Both of these perspectives, although they feel incredibly real at the time that you experience them, are illusory. I don't think that hope has to be unsustainable or fleeting in this way. I think it can be sustainable. And so this is the mantra that I want to sort of inhabit. When I'm suffering, I want to know in my heart that I won't always be suffering. And when I'm happy, I want to know that I won't always be happy, because I think it's equally important to be able to know that at all times. But always I want to be able to know that there will eventually be joy again. And I think that kind of hope is actually possible. So they say it takes a village to raise a child, and I say it takes a village to give a talk. In a normal technical talk, I would use a slide like this to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators, and maybe talk about related work that was deeply inspiring or something. And that's exactly what I'm going to do in this not entirely typical talk. I want to thank all of these people in alphabetical order by last name for mentoring me and for caring for me so that I can be here right now. I could not have possibly given this talk without you. Thank you. And thank you for being here and listening.
Was a long applause. That's nice. So we have some time for questions, and also feel free to post questions on Slido. You can enter the code POMW19. Heidi, if you want to ask questions anonymously or not. This was from a previous question. Oh, sorry, there's one question. Yeah.
I guess I have a couple of questions that kind of go hand in hand. I guess one is, while it's really important for your own mental health to be open and advocating for yourself in these environments, not all environments are willing to let you do that. So I guess how do you protect yourself while still pushing for advocacy for yourself in that space?
So the question was, how would I navigate in a space where there wasn't the possibility for me to advocate for myself effectively?
Yeah, just for example, being honest about imposter syndrome in an environment that wouldn't support you being honest, or puts you at risk when you are honest about that.
I wish that we lived in a society with so many fewer environments like that. And I'm not sure what the answer is personally for a person in that situation, because it's not always the case that you can just leave and find a better environment. I think there's a real value in so-called whisper networks of people who are experiencing similar things, trying to listen carefully for people who voice similar concerns and finding these sort of embedded communities of people who are suffering in similar ways. But part of the work is people who are able to speak out, who have the kind of anchoring in that community that they know that they're not going to be ostracized or experience negative consequences for speaking out doing so. So I don't know. It's hard. And you said you had a part two?
I guess it was kind of answering the second question, like as people who are support networks for others who have like mental illness or like with it, like what can we be doing to support that? So I guess you kind of answered that a little bit.
Okay. I think I see some things in the Slido. How do I walk the line of informing an advisor about mental illness and how it might affect my work versus not wanting to disclose too much? I suspect strongly that any advisor who's been an advisor for any significant amount of time has seen other students who experience difficulties with mental health, just because of the numbers that I was showing in this slideshow. And if they haven't seen it in students that they've been mentoring who have been PhD students, they've seen it in undergraduates who they've taught. Something that I think is important is finding an advisor who you can trust enough to talk about these things earnestly with. I think that kind of relationship is vital to being able to do good work. And if you aren't able to speak frankly with your advisor about that, well, it might be because you fear how they're going to react, or it might be because you know how they're going to react. And I guess the answers are different in those cases. Like if your advisor is going around like talking about like how mental illness isn't real or something, then like my response would be like to get out of there, because that's dangerous for me. But I know not everyone can do that. And again, I think I just have to turn to the suggestion of finding support among your peers when you're in a situation where you're stuck and you in an institutional environment where you can't be open. I do think, though, that you will find that most people in academia who aren't experiencing mental illness and have not experienced mental illness know a lot of people who have. They just don't talk about it as much as I think they should. So you may get more compassion. I think you will get more compassion than you're expecting to. Oops.
Maybe one more question.
One more question. Was there one in the audience? I thought I saw someone raising a hand at one point. Yes.
So first and foremost, thank you. I think this presentation was amazing and kind of made me feel like I'm not alone in all of this. I just wanted to ask, is there anything you found that's helpful on those days where you just can't even, where you're able to come to terms with it, I guess, or keep going?
Right now, on the days when I just can't even, I don't even. And I have the luxury of a job that supports me in that for the most part. I think surrounding yourself with bodily comforts is incredibly important, because I do believe that the mind and the body are way more intrinsically linked than most people believe them to be. I recommend talking to friends, especially friends in academia, but also especially friends outside of academia. Like, find a good balance. And also, neglected in my thank you slide is my cat, because he's been a really important part of those days when I can't. Yeah. Yes, in the Google shirt.
Kind of building on that, do you think it's, on those kinds of days, do you think it's productive to try to push through it if you think you maybe possibly can? Because like I always fear like, okay, if I just take a break because I'm not really feeling it today, just can we keep sort of spiraling, and versus sometimes when I find that I'm able to distract myself with like an interesting task, and sometimes that sort of draws me in, but at the same time, like, do you think that's something that you need to be cautious of just trying to force yourself to keep going when it's like that?
So the question, to repeat for the recording, is it ever productive to force yourself or like ask yourself to continue working on something even when it feels like one of those days when you just can't possibly? And I think, yes, the answer is probably there are days like that. And there are days that have definitely been like that for me, where I have actually gotten stuff done when I didn't think I was going to be able to. But what I think is really important to do is to draw a box around the time. So I might say to myself something like, okay, I feel like I really cannot possibly do this thing. I could either just not do this thing, which is a choice I can make, or I might say, maybe I might be able to do this thing. And I'm going to try to do this thing without doing anything else for half an hour or 10 minutes. And then if I can't do the thing, guilt removed. Go rest. Because if I couldn't engage at all in that amount of time, the time box gives me the opportunity to really say I'm allowed to stop. So I think it's when you say I'm going to make the decision to push, I think it's really important to make the decision to push within a particular constraint.